excited for today's community conversation, um, where we're going to be talking to CT Nguyen about data, trust, and transparency today. So I just want to make sure that, all right, we're ready to roll. How are you today?
I am good.
I am so excited for this. We had the pleasure of connecting um, now just a few months ago at the Prindle Institute at DePaul University. And you did this amazing talk, and I was just so blown away and so grateful that when I followed up, I said, I want to talk about what we unpacked and what you kind of walk through. Because we have a nonprofit audience who, especially smaller organizations, they might not have uh, time or capacity to think about philosophical questions. But it's important to make time for philosophical questions. So before we kind of get into it, and we do have some folks who are kind of trickling in for the live discussion, but why don't you give a little bit of background about who you are and the work that you do, and then we can kind of go from there.
I am associate professor at University of Utah. I'm a philosopher. I work in two areas. One of the areas is the area called social epistemology, and it's basically about how knowledge gets created and disseminated in communities. It's about understanding how we understand things together.
Yeah.
And there, I've been obsessed with. There's a question I've been really into for a really long time. That for a long time, no one else knew why I was obsessed with it. And it's for me the question of how the non-expert properly identifies which expert to trust. A lot of people, this is simple, and I think no. The deep thing about our era is that this is a very hard problem to get around because knowledge is so. My favorite way of putting this is from the philosopher Elijah Milgram in his book The Great Endarkenment. He says the particular feature of our era is that knowledge is so hyper specialized that no one actually understands any complete argument in the world, like any real thought that leads to like, here's how a car works, here how antibiotics works, here's the concrete you should use in your nuclear containment facility. All of these cross so many scientific subdisciplines, chemistry, physics, right? All that no single person can actually survey all of them. And what we end up doing is trusting people in fields whose expertise we can't understand for ourselves and we can't vet for ourselves.
Yeah.
So what happens is we get intermediaries. We start trusting things like social signifiers. Like, I trust this person because they have published several articles in the New England Journal of Medicine. I trust that person because they're a professor at Princeton. But that means that it's not that you're not trusting anymore, that you've solved the problem. You've just like outsourced the trusting act to a particular institution. And then you have to figure out which one to trust, right? And so I think that's the background space that I got really interested in the question of transparency metrics.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part, folks, this is the part that when I've brought this question up in terms of because you pose something that for all intents and purposes has like screwed up my life in a very good way.
I want to hear
because
how.
because I would say kind of in my world, in our sector, I'm one of those social signifiers in many ways to say, these are the data points that you should pay attention to. This is the reports that I think that you should check out. And kind of that's our role in some ways at our company. And then that made me go, but wait, we need to question that very basis here in that foundation. And really the thing that the data people that I've brought this up since talking to you, that's driven them nuts is when I say there is an inherent contradiction between, in some ways, trust and transparency. Don't assign a value to it automatically. This is what you also employed.
Do you want me to run through the basic argument?
Go through the basic argument
Okay.
because I think folks will get a better handle of why this is going to be such a very interesting conversation
Right.
today.
So, I was thinking about metrics a lot, and I was in general thinking about how a lot of the metrics we face look really thin, right? Like, so I'm a professor, and a lot of the times I think, my students are judged by GPA, and there's a lot of other features besides GPA that are valuable. Like, their social connections, their ability to work in a group, their curiosity, their creativity. And very little of this gets picked up in a GPA. So I was already thinking about that. And then I found this argument from Anara O'Neill, who's a bioethicist, pioneering bioethicist. And it's this line, this throwaway line in her BBC Rife Lectures on Trust, in which she says, people think trust and transparency go together, but they're actually deeply in tension because trust asks non-experts to, transparency asks experts to explain their reasoning to non-experts. At this point, when you just put it that boldly, you're like, wait, that's right. Because the whole point of expertise is your reasons are not completely comprehensible to non-experts. That's the point of an expert, right? An expert is someone that has access to kinds of reasoning and kinds of consideration that other people don't have. I mean, by the way, I just want to pause and say, this can start to sound dangerously elitist, but what I actually think is not like there's some small class of the real experts, but that everybody is an expert in something, some little patch, and then not an expert in everything else, right?
Yeah.
So if a system of transparency is one where an expert has to explain themselves to a non-expert, they can't actually use their actual full reasons, right? So what Onara O'Neill thought was that experts have to make up fake reasons for consumption by the non-experts. And so they'll lie, and so they'll undermine trust. I think that can happen, but I think a lot of the time something even worse happens, which is that experts stop taking actions unless they can justify those actions in publicly comprehensible terms. So the short version of this is that the more intrusive the transparency system, the more it undermines expertise because it confines experts to acting on reasons that would be comprehensible to non-experts. And here, I just want to say that, like, look, I think transparency sounds really good when you're the person who's looking at the metric, and the metric is about something that you don't know a lot about. But when you're on the flip side, when you're under the gun of a transparency system, I think every single one of us knows what this looks like. What it looks like is trying to squeeze the complexity of your understanding, right, of some particular situation into this really thin. So a lot of those metrics in education, what a lot of those metrics look like are either student satisfaction scores or GPAs or performance on standardized tests. And I think we all know that there's a lot more to education, but also it's very difficult to have any kind of quick, publicly agreed upon way to measure something like intellectual humility or responsiveness or openness, right? So maybe I should pause here and get your thoughts, but that's the general idea is that transparency systems, I'm not saying that transparency systems are bad. I'm saying that there's a trade-off. There's a hidden cost. Transparency gets rid of the possibility of corruption and bias by forcing people to reason in public. But by that same measure, the demand to reason in public starts to undermine the expert's ability to act for reasons that aren't instantly comprehensible to everyone. Let me just give one example that I found for your sector that I found really compelling in doing my background research. So for a long time, a lot of nonprofit donation is ruled by Charity Navigator, right?
Yep.
And a transparency and accountability service that rates nonprofits. And for a long time, a lot of the majority of Charity Navigator's rankings were using something called a throughput metric. So the throughput metric is, there are different names for it. The throughput metric is what percentage of the donations to the nonprofit get through to the other side. So this sounds good enough to me that I used to use these in my ethics classes. I'd be like, okay, now we're going to get together money, and then we're going to look at the top things on Charity Navigator, and we're going to decide where to put it. And when you read some in the literature, it turns out this is a really poor metric because it forces nonprofits to compete on reducing overhead. So, for example, if a nonprofit that is helping get cleaner water spends money on, say, water infrastructure in some village, that counts as good throughput. But if they hire an internal expert on bacteria, that counts as internal costs and so the metric reads it as waste. So I think one of the things that really shows up here is that the demand for quick comprehensibility cuts out a lot of the contextual details. And because, in some sense, every single one of us is suffering from some complex version of the Dunning-Kruger effect, we don't know what we're missing when we're looking at these quick and easy metrics. So there's this deep divide between the cost and the advantages of public comprehensibility.
I mean, there's so many ways to take that, and I'm happy that you kind of even zeroed in on overhead as one of the easiest examples of this. There's a whole movie that just came out called Uncharitable from a guy named Dan Pallotta, who he had a very famous TED Talk attacking the scarcity mindset of overhead and saying we need to invest in things like, salary and back-end infrastructure and things of those natures. And if we immediately start valuing the efficiency of a nonprofit solely on the throughput, then we're doing things wrong. And so I think that's a very pertinent example, but I think there's so many different ways that even somebody who's new to the nonprofit world, donors, even tech companies like mine, we have to grapple with this question. We have to ask ourselves this question. I think it's also important and very important for everybody watching now or later. We're not going to have an answer today. That's kind of the point. But we're going to have a good discussion about it. So where can people, in your opinion, start to address this in their own lives? How can they make this something that is not just, oh, that was a very interesting conversation, let me move on?
Right. So one thing I think is to maintain a kind of suspicion towards metrics. And I'm not saying ignore them, but I think towards other people, all of us have a natural and very healthy suspicion, right? One of the things we think is, we don't immediately assume that everyone is telling us the truth. And we don't immediately assume that everyone is giving us all the information. We don't immediately assume that everyone is, we typically think that people are often acting on their interests, and we look for what their interests are, and we look for what they're telling us and not telling us. So I think one basic thing you can think is to treat metrics like people in the following way. Know that they have a standpoint, know that they have interests, and know that they're leaving out things. I think there's a tendency. So Theodore Porter's book, Trust in Numbers, is an incredible book. He's a historian of quantification culture. And his claim isn't that quantification is bad. He thinks it's very powerful because it can aggregate vast amounts of information. But he thinks that we have a tendency to instantly trust anything that's in quantitative form without, it somehow gets past our suspicion filters. We just treat it as trustworthy. So that's problem one, that we tend to be immediately naive towards metrics without worrying whether they're good or bad. I think problem two is even more sophisticated. So problem two is that even if you have the best available metric, no metric, because of the nature of metrics, will capture everything important. Because in order to gather that much information, any metric needs to have an input filter. So here's one way to put it. I really like, there's this incredible book from Bowker and Starr, Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, called Sorting Things Out.
I love that book. You're the one who recommended it to me, and I just have been eating that book up. So keep going. Sell people on this book, because that's the book that
isn't that book amazing?
The book is so good.
So what the book ends up saying is that so it's from this field called science and technology studies. And one of the most interesting things about this field, oh my God, this book is so good.
It's so good.
Is this view that every information system has to selectively leave things out. Mm-hmm. So here's a sidebar. Here's an easy way into it. Dennis Woods has this great book called The Power of Maps. And what The Power of Maps says is that every map has to leave something out or it's useless as a map, right? So there's a story from Borges that's basically like, look, what happens when you have a perfectly detailed map? It's the same size as the world. It's not useful for anything, right? A map has to leave things out. What does it leave out? So Woods ends up saying, well, what it leaves out depends on the interest of the person who made the map. And what you can see is that maps don't give you the information you want because they were made for some other interest. right? So he ends up saying, like, look at the maps we have. They give you a lot of freeway information. They don't give you information about where the sound is good. They don't give you information about what smells good or bad. They don't give you a lot of information. Like, there's a lot of information that they don't have. Maps
Mm.
tend to be, the maps that we have tend to be really good at giving you information about basically where the roads are and where the property is. Some of the background thought is that most maps that were originally made for two purposes. One was military navigation, and the other was keeping track of who owned what property for tax collection. So they're made for the purpose of tax collection, not for the purposes of our interests. And so they
Yeah.
don't capture a lot of information that we might be interested in, right? It's really, he has this whole chapter that's like, one of the things you might care the most about a city is sound quality. Where does it sound lovely and nice? That's just not on a map. You could have put that on a map, but it's not on there. It's been abstracted out because of the interests of the
Maps
people
are not
involved.
designed for the commons by
Right.
default.
Well, you could be. So I learned a lot of the stuff from this. I forget his name, but he's a Yale mapping professor. He's at radicalcartographer.net or something.
Yes, I know. Yes, I know this. I know. Yeah,
Right.
keep
So
going.
you could design the point isn't that it's essential. You could design a sound map. It's just not the maps we have in common
Yeah.
because certain interests have formulated those maps. So Bowker and Starr say the same thing about any classification system. So to input information to a classification system, which is required for any metric, you need to have a standardized categorization vocabulary. So their book involves a case study of mortality statistics, which internationally use the ICD, which is a classification system and a taxonomy for a taxonomy system for different kinds of accidents, diseases, causes of death,
Yep.
cause of injury. And one of the interesting things about so here's what they point out. One, the ICD needs to be stable across a large realm, or it's not going to be able to aggregate the information, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it needs a standard taxonomy. But that taxonomy can't capture everything because we're abstracting. We have limited information. And so they have all these. So one of my favorite studies, there's like, look at the possible codes for falls. There's like falling from a sidewalk, falling from playground equipment, falling from a desk, falling from furniture. There's all these fall categories
Yeah.
for urban environments. And then there's like two for nature, right? There's like falling from a cliff and other natural falls cause unspecified. This shows your interest, right? The people that made the classification system were much more interested in urban environments than in natural environments, right?
Yep.
That betrays a particular interest. So again, the point is that in order to capture information, we need to have a classification system in common, and that classification system needs to delete certain information and create these buckets, right? So one of the other pressures, inherent pressures on metrics, is that the information system, a system is prepared to capture certain information that it knows ahead of time it wants to capture, and it's really hard to insert other information. So for me, I experienced this in grading all the time, right? The system is prepared to capture information like what their grade was, whether they attended class, right? It's not prepared for information like, oh, the student was doing really well, but then their parents got long COVID in the middle of it, and then they couldn't come to class for a while, and they just didn't
Yeah.
get a good grade. But they like, so here's the interesting thing. I can actually enter that into a note in the system, but that note doesn't aggregate, right? Because it isn't in a pre-prepared classification that is set up to count and aggregate. So the big picture here, there are two pressures here we've talked about. One is the pressure that metrics, because they're data collection systems, and data collection systems leave things out systematically, they're
Mm-hmm.
always missing that kind of localized dynamic information. And two, insofar as the system is designed for public comprehensibility, that means the evaluative procedure of the recording has to be public. That is, right? So if I'm under the gun of a metric, I can't report my success in terms of increasing student humility if the way I report student humility is I just decide how more humble they got, right? That isn't a public transparency metric. A public transparency metric needs to have some evaluative procedure that's comprehensible to the public, which means it can't deploy expertise. So it's going to be things like grades. salary. We know what these look like, right?
Yeah.
In the educational environment, it's like what is your graduation rate? What is your graduation speed? What is your employment rate? What is the postgraduate salary? They're all things that are kind of measurable on some publicly repeatable form. What that leaves out is any kind of expert sensitivity. So there's the exact claim. A lot of expert judgments are these kind of rich, synthetic, experiential judgments that don't follow some kind of publicly available decision procedure. That's what you need experience for. Our whole worry was that that decision procedure, if you left it intuitive, kind of intuitive and synthetic for experts, then that's where corruption and bias creeps in. We know that's where corruption and bias creep in. That is absolutely true. My worry is that kind of intuitive, experience-based reasoning is not only where corruption and bias creep in, it's also where expertise and sensitivity come in, right?
Mm.
And when you apply a transparency methodology that requires that all the information be written down explicitly, the decision and justifications be explicit, or the measures be in some form of success that everyone understands, then you're washing expertise out of the system. You're getting something. You are genuinely cutting out the possibility of corruption and bias, but you're also eliminating to some degree experts' ability to be expert. So my claim in general is that there is a trade-off. There's a cost.
There is a trade-off. Yeah.
I'm not saying that transparency is all good or all bad. I'm saying, like a lot of things, I think in the paper what I say is like transparency is like chemo, right? It is rough medicine that does its job and saves us from a lot of stuff and is very costly. And you just have to decide how much you want.
The example that stuck with me in sorting things out was they were talking about reporting on when somebody committed suicide in Spain. There was a policy decision at some point that they would do two different metric reports. What they told the family, and then the private submission that actually said this was a suicide. They would hide the fact that it was a suicide in some cases to then tell them it was something else, a different type of cause. And that was an intentional decision to hide things that has some pretty deep, like, ethical problems with it.
Here's another one. I was just rereading sorting things out because I'm writing some more stuff in it, and I'm so struck by this moment where they say, okay, so in a lot of mortality reporting statistics, you can only report one cause of death, right?
Yeah.
So it's gotten a little more complicated. Now you can report like 2 or 3, but still there's a primary or there's still a handful. So for a long time for data collection, you can only report one cause of death. And so now there's this really important determiner you have to figure out. If the person, okay, let's say the person was hit by a car, but also had underlying health problems that came from maybe they're suffering from long COVID and they had a couple other things, right? And they have like poor heart health, and then they die. Their heart fails after being hit by a car. What is that a death by car? Is that a death by long COVID? Like what do you report it as? And for a long time, the instructions for the ICD were report if you have a decision between 2 causes of death, report the one that is the more costly to society. Right. So, I mean, you can just clearly and explicitly see in the instructions for use that we see what this is for. This is for keeping track of what are the costliest sources of disease in the world, right? So I just want to start, there are 2 separate, I just want to be really clear that there are 2 separate threads that we've been talking about. One is that any data collection system inherently leaves out things because the system needs to have a standardized application. And 2 is that in any public metric, not only do we have the problem of data, we have the further, more stringent constraint that the metric needs to be in terms that are comprehensible to everyone, which filters out expertise. When I gave that talk, did we talk about the notion of mechanical objectivity?
You did touch on it, but it wasn't very deep.
Okay. The next book you should read is Lorraine Daston's new book, Rules. You'll love this.
Okay.
So there's this notion in Daston and Porter about how a lot of the things that we measure and the rules that we apply in things like evaluation procedures are under the constraint of mechanical objectivity. So we want to be data is supposed to be objective, right? Metrics are supposed to be objective, but objective means so many different things. And what objectivity means in what mechanical objectivity is, it is that the judgment is repeatable by anyone of any skill level.
Yeah.
So think about, for example, a concept like adulthood. There are all these rights we grant to adults, like the right to vote, the right to drive, the right to buy alcohol, right? The right to, I mean, we also think that it's deeply entangled with the ability to consent in various ways, right? What that stuff we probably are intending to tie all these rights to is something like intellectual and emotional maturity, right? But here's a standard that's not mechanically objective, especially in a legal institution. You get to vote if we decide that you're emotionally mature. That's not something that's a repeatable judgment, right?
Yeah.
Different people will apply that in different ways. So here's a different standard that's very repeatable. You get to vote when you're 18. 18, does that make sense? So
Yeah.
18 is a mechanical standard, and that standard has mechanical objectivity. Anyone will apply it in the same way to different people. But in order to get the mechanical objectivity, you lose all kinds of sensitivity and nuance, right? Can you see it? Does that make sense?
Because you turned 18 doesn't mean any of those other things in terms
Right.
of emotional maturity are there
Right.
at all.
Right. But it's the kind of standard that we can apply at the institutional level precisely because it's repeatable by anyone, right?
And the
So
higher you go in society, the more likely, the larger the data set, the more likely that expert nuance is getting really just burned
right.
out.
So another version of this is I read like I was I ended up in a room with a bunch of people building creative AI a few years ago,
Yeah.
and they're all like using a data set to train their AI to make better art. But the data set they were using was just what got you more engagement hours on Netflix. That's a mechanical standard that
Yeah.
washes out every bit of expert nuance and sensitivity about the goodness of art. So the thing that I'm really trying to get at is, I mean, of course, there are lots of reasons that we want to be objective, mechanically objective in particular. Like, I think it's great that voting age is tied to 18 and nothing else, right? We need some clear, bright line that we can apply to everyone that you can't cheat your way around if you're like a corrupt judge or something. That's super important in that case, especially because we're really up against the possibility of, especially for voting rights, there's so much corruption around that it's more important to have, most of us think, a really clear, bright standard
Yeah.
than it is to be super sensitive. But there's a huge cost, and that cost you may not want to pay in other places, right? Like the cost of large scale public comprehensibility is this washing out of sensitivity and context and nuance. And in general, I just think there's this massive trade-off. And the thing that we need to be aware of is that we're always paying a cost when we demand transparency, and to ask if that cost is worth paying, because we're losing. I mean, I think one of the things we're losing is the ability. The reason we want to use experts in the first place is because they understand shit we don't. They understand things that we do not understand. So in order to get the full power of expertise, then you have to let them do things that you don't understand. The more you demand, but then of course they can screw you. They can do things that are super corrupt and biased. So the more you try to bring them within your sight, and the more you try to put regimes of accountability on them that you, the non-expert, can understand, the more you rein in their expertise. So I just think there's a trade-off between. So one of my favorite philosophers, Annette Beyer, says the essence of trust is to make yourself vulnerable by putting some part of your power in somebody else. What I think is, right, when you trust experts, you become more powerful insofar as the experts are good, but more vulnerable to those experts. If you try to foreclose on that vulnerability with systems of transparency, you're safer, but you also get to harness the power of expertise less and less. So there's just a trade-off.
I could talk about this for hours, as you know. But we only committed to just this half an hour. So I think that's a perfect endpoint for this conversation too. But T, I think like these types of questions are so important as a society, and nonprofits play such an important role here. But giving them this time, and I want to thank the people who watch this, I want to thank the people who are going to watch this. Give yourself this time to reflect on these big questions, because the very future of our society depends on this. So thank you so much, everyone. We're going to end it today, but we'll be back. I want to have more of these philosophical conversations, by the way. So this was a pleasure, and I'm really, really thankful for your time today, T.
Thank you.
Have a great day, folks.